Everybody, I'm just amazed that so many people have torn themselves away from television on a weeknight and come to listen to me talk about history. I'm so grateful. This has been such a joy, this whole story. I don't think I can begin to convey the thrill as a journalist in being involved in such a special project. Every journo dreams of a great scoop. Every journo dreams, all of us dream of a treasure hunt, and this was both. It's an adventure that happened because of a hunch, and it happened because there are still, mercifully, people who understand that long-form journalism matters, and it can sometimes get great results. So let me just talk for a moment about what these photos are all about. You've seen from history a lot of old-fashioned fuddy-duddy pictures of guys standing looking very, very formal. These are not those. The joy of the Lost Diggers pics, which we found in a French farmhouse attic 2 years ago, is that they are basically boisterous, larrikin Aussie soldiers having a good time. And this one, to me, encapsulates why they matter. If you look very, very closely, you can see just here on this gentleman's wrist what is a map of Australia, a shape of Australia that he carved out of a bully beef tin. And we know that this photograph was taken probably in about 1918, maybe even early 1919. These blokes have survived the war, they're waiting to go home, and they're making a laconic comment to their mums, "We want our mummies." And they're letting their hair down, they look like bikies. But what I love about it is you wouldn't have had this photograph at the beginning of the war. This is an image that Australians wouldn't have had of themselves in 1914 when the war began. In 1914, Australians thought of themselves as going off to fight for king and country, to fight for Mother England. By 1918, they were thinking of themselves as Australians, which is why they had that little bit of metal on their wrists. They'd fought and died as mates. They've learned to think of themselves as Aussies. There's another thing about this particular image that I love, is that the bloke up on the top right, his name's probably Belden, Thomas Belden, and his relatives up in Queensland contacted us with great excitement, thinking that he was their long lost, I think, great uncle, I think it was. And just on the way here, to give you an example of how much of an ongoing discovery this story is, we had a call from somebody because I put an appeal out on Facebook. It turned out that Belden's family, when we contacted them, he died, sadly, in 1918 in one of the last offences of the war. And when the family looked at the medals, they discovered they had the wrong medals. There was another bloke's name on the back, a guy called Clifton Fitton. And just on the way here this evening, I got an email because I put an appeal out on our page, and there are people like yourselves who have a passion, a love for history. And I'd said, can anybody help me? We're trying to find relatives of a particular digger called Fitton. And after 2 or 3 days, a bloke comes back to us and says, I found his great niece on the central coast of New South Wales. So as soon as I've finished here tonight, I'm going to ring her with great excitement and say, we've got some medals for you. Let's go to where this all came from. Here's Paris. Amiens is here, and Vignacourt, the little town I'm taking you to, was about half an hour northwest of Amiens. And during the First World War, this is an old map from the period during the First World War that shows what they did. The soldiers were so overwhelmed by the degree of fighting in the trenches that within about 3 or 4 days, they were rotated out and put into these rest areas. And so you can see here, there's a sort of a rest area. There's the front line running down here, where the Germans had advanced, and the Allied forces had basically stopped them here, and they were all dug in. You all know your history. But what the Allied commanders realised was that this modern warfare, men couldn't cope with it for longer than a few days, and they were rotated out. And they didn't want to take them very far, so they created rest areas. And this little town of Vignacourt, which I won't even try and show you on the map here, but it's in this area here. Vignacourt basically was a town where people came to let their hair down and rest. And in that town was this bloke, a guy called Louis Toulier. And he was a man who had a passion for photography. And he and his beautiful wife, Antoinette Toulier, lived in a farmhouse in Vignacourt, and they were local farmers, but their land was requisitioned by the local Allied command, who took over the whole village. And in order to make a buck, they started selling photographs. And I should explain that in Australia today, there are probably faded bits of cardboard in collections all around Australia, and people are wondering, what are these? And the problem that Louis and Antoinette had was to turn out enough photos quickly enough in order to meet the demand. Because they generated, we think, maybe as many as 10 to 20,000 photographs. We found 4,000 glass plate photographic negatives, and I'll take you to those in a moment. And what they did was they developed a technique called POP, print on paper. And it was great because you could get a bit of photosensitive paper, hold the exposed glass plate negative up against it, and you could create a print. The only problem was that print faded within a few years, and that's why this collection stayed hidden. Because while Louis and Antoinette realised the historical significance of what they had, the blokes that sent these photos home didn't understand that technology was limited. And so as a result, that process, that print, often faded. And unless it was reproduced, a lot of these photographs disappeared and were not seen until we've dug them up again in this French farmhouse. And this is the home of Louis and Antoinette Toulier, and for many, many months we drove past it trying to find the location of this mysterious hoard of photographs that we'd heard about. And we were having no luck. We'd even knocked on this door trying to find the owners because we knew it was one of the old Toulier houses. Little did we know, right up there, underneath that window, were 3 treasure chests. And it wasn't until the 1980s that anybody in the Toulier family realised what they were sitting on. And this fellow, Robert Cronier, was the first to solve the mystery. Robert was a local photographer and a Toulier relative who lived in Vignacourt. He was like the guy that did all the friendly pictures for the local council whenever there was a visiting dignitary. And in the 1980s, he heard that there was an Australian minister visiting from Victoria, from the Victorian Parliament. And he'd heard about this odd collection of photographs that was somewhere in the town. And by chance, he found a small number of the glass photographic negative plates. And he developed them and put them up on the council wall. And everybody was amazed at the quality of them, but nobody asked where are they all from and how many more are there, except for this bloke, a guy called Laurent Marouz. And Laurent is very much the guy who's the hero of this whole discovery. I'd love to claim it was me what found it, but it was Laurent who is the true genius and the passionate lover of Australian military history in France, who I'd really love to pay credit to. Laurent's the Chesterfield sofa franchise holder for Western Europe, so if you need a sofa, let me know. He lives in a lovely chateau in the Loire Valley, and he's bored, and he loves history. He loves his history. And so he heard about these images on the wall of the Vignacourt Town Hall in the mid-1980s. There was only about 24 of them. He went and had a look at them, and he met Robert and said, "These are fantastic. You know, can I interest the Australians? Is there a bigger collection?" Robert goes, yeah, there's a bigger collection, but he's a bit cagey about it. And so what happens is Laurent writes to the Australian Defence Attaché in the Australian Embassy in Paris. He publishes a couple of articles in military journals, including one British military journal, saying, "Hey, there's a fantastic collection of photographs out there. Please, anybody interested, let us know." And nobody answers. Nobody comes. So when we finally rang Laurent about a year ago, he did cry eventually. He was so happy to hear from us. And we hired him to help us find the remaining Toulier relatives and to track down this difficult collection. And we also took with us this lovely man, Peter Burness, who's one of Australia's most eminent First World War historians. He's based at the Australian War Memorial. Not being a historian myself, I thought if we're going to be dealing with this collection, We wanted to be sure that we dealt with it properly and that we understood what we were looking at. So he came along with us. And I shot a series of stories for the Sunday night television program that you can still watch on our website if you're interested. You can just Google The Lost Diggers. Anyway, picture a dusty attic, a spiral set of stairs. We're pushing aside cobwebs, and we come to this wall of World War II jerry cans, like dozens of them. And we've got Christian Tullier, who's the Avocat lawyer relative of the Tullier family, who's somewhat cautiously agreed to show us what he thinks is in their attic. And we've agreed to help him find it. And we're lifting these World War II jerry cans and pushing aside old prams and thinking, what are we doing? And then we see these treasure chests. It's unbelievable that these really were sitting in this attic for nearly 100 years. They've been through summer, winter, bitter cold, bitter heat. And in those treasure chests were the most incredible collection of negative glass plates. 4,000 glass plate negatives, many of them in excellent condition. And Peter, at this very moment in this image, is looking at one of them, and he's actually reading. You can see with such clarity, he's actually saying to me, well, that bloke's a 5th Battalion soldier. You can see the badge. And then we realised we can actually help identify these blokes. We've got 4,000 images of Allied soldiers. How do we find out who these guys are? You're looking into their eyes, and when we came back to Sydney, we had them scanned by a company here in Sydney called Ausscans. And we were able to generate incredibly high quality images, in some cases 1/4 gigabyte of information. And we were able to zoom in on those images. We also found, and this is the lovely part, I couldn't believe this was still there. One of the things that always intrigued Peter Burness was we'd always known there was a collection out there somewhere because there was this very definitive, distinctive banner backdrop. This was the backdrop, still sitting in the attic. And what happened was very tragic. Louis had been a motorcycle dispatch rider in the First World War. He had a year of service and suffered quite a serious injury. But the family, when they came to Australia a few weeks ago for the launch of an exhibition at the War Memorial, I put to them a theory that we've developed in the book. Antoinette threw all of these negatives, all of the cameras, into these chests and threw them up into the attic in the 1930s. Because in 1930, Louis took a pistol and blew his brains out. He couldn't deal with the awfulness, I suspect, of what he'd seen. I mean, 66%, 2/3 of the young men that came through his rooms and had their photos taken were either killed or terribly wounded. And the family agrees with me that they think that he just couldn't deal with it. And so he shot himself. And Antoinette was so stricken with sorrow, she basically threw everything in the attic and forgot about it. The Nazis came through in World War II, turned the attic upside down and stole the cameras. They didn't even consider the negatives. And interestingly, until we actually knocked on the door, the reason the house was empty was it was about to be sold. And they were going to throw the negatives away. And mercifully, because of the intercession of our chairman at Channel 7, Kerry Stokes, who is a passionate lover of Australian military history, he gave me a blank cheque, basically, to go and buy these glass plates for the Australian War Memorial. That's what we did. Now, I'm told that somewhere in the audience here there is somebody who is a relative of the gentleman sitting in the sidecar. Is Noreen here? Anyway, I'll get you to introduce yourself a little bit later. But we, unfortunately, at the time that I finished writing the manuscript for the book, to give you an example of how rapid things have developed, we didn't know the identity of the man sitting in the sidecar, but we now do. And maybe in the question and answer we can make some introductions. But these two gentlemen are military medal winners. And again, what we did was, in order to enable identification of men like this, what we did was put every single image up on Facebook. And my wife will tell you we've got a 13 and an 18-year-old daughter who, if they had their way, they'd be on Facebook all the time. And I felt like a bit of a Luddite, intimidated by this modern technology and worrying about why my daughters were on it all night. But one of them was integral in suggesting to me, well, why don't you actually create a Facebook page as well as a website page? And so we scanned every single photograph, and it's still there. You can either just Google Lost Diggers and you'll find it. And you can go through every single image. And the great thing about Facebook is that people were able to volunteer information and suggest information. And some of the photos I just love because they show a relationship between the people of this little town and the Allied soldiers between themselves. There's a French soldier there, there's a British soldier there, and there's Australian soldiers, and there's French civilians. And they were chatting up the French girls. This is where they had a time to let their hair down. Many of them have got mud on their boots. They've come in from battles. In this one, it's shot probably in December of 1916, in the cold, cold winter of 1916, 1917. I love this image because it just says so much about this stiff French soldier surrounded by these larrikin, rough as guts Aussie soldiers. And the reason they're smoking, it's been explained to me by people who know more than I do about the time, everybody smoked to keep warm. It was so bitterly cold. And those sheepskin vests, one of the reasons we're able to place it to 1916 is because Peter Burness has been able to tell me that that particular design came in that particular period. And often one of the ways we've been able to identify people is by looking at the design of webbing or the shape of tunics or the particular badges. Then we started getting, if you like, IDs on people of great significance. The gentleman in the bottom right in this image is one of our most decorated heroes, Joe Maxwell VC. And I didn't even have to put this one up on Facebook because Peter Burness, he just sat still and looked in awe at this image because it's Joe Maxwell VC at the peak of his powers. And Joe is the gentleman who wrote that wonderful book, Hell's Bells and Mademoiselles, which I do recommend to you. It's a first-person account, the likes of which you will never read again. I didn't know there was so much premarital sex going on in the film. Joe was a bit of a larrikin, he was a bit of a rascal, but he was also one of our most decorated combat veterans. There's a great story about how he helped breach the Hindenburg Line, one of the major German defences in 1918. All of his men were getting mown down around him, and there were these huge rolls of barbed wire that they just couldn't get through. Normally they used a kind of a torpedo bomb that they'd push out across the ground to blow up the barbed wire, and it just wasn't working, it was too thick. And the accounts of what he did are just awesome. He literally jumped up and walked across the barbed wire under full enfilading German machine gun fire, ran across the back and knocked out 2 German machine guns. How he survived, nobody quite knows, but the incredible thing is, by the age of 22, he was just 22 years old, he'd won the military medal twice, which is an incredible achievement. He'd won the DCM and he'd won the VC, all by the age of 22. And if you read his book, and I recommend it to you, you can hear the other side of the story. This poor man came back to Australia, and like so many of these blokes, was basically ignored, went back into civilian life, had a lot of trouble with the grog, had a lot of trouble dealing with normal family life. This one didn't though. Jim Holland. Last week I was in Perth, and Jim Holland's beautiful 92-year-old daughter, Kathleen, came up to me and planted a big kiss on my cheek. And we had a call from Judy Carroll, who's Jim Holland's great-granddaughter, and she recognised Jim in the photographs. One of Jim's descendants is Val Lehman, who played B. Smith, I think, from Prisoner, very famous Australian actress. And she told us great stories about how Jim never really spoke much about the war, he just joked about it. But Jim was a machine gunner, and we called him a handsome digger. We made him our cover photograph. And we weren't 100% sure when we went to see Kathleen and Reg, his 2 children, in Perth. We weren't 100% sure that it'd be was in fact Jim. So we'd blown up, and you might have seen this on the story, it was a beautiful moment. We all cried. We'd blown up a beautiful photograph of Jim and wrapped it in brown paper. We presented one photograph to each of the twins, Reg and Kathleen. And then there's this pause as Kathleen opens the paper. And then there's an even longer pause. You can feel the earth opening beneath you, thinking, oh my God, we've come all the way to Perth and it's not him. And then she tips her head back and she goes, oh, it's a photograph of Papa. And it was just the most beautiful moment. And that's the thing I've loved about this whole story, is it's brought us together with families, with parts of their history that they didn't even know existed. They'd never seen this photograph before. And it's happened time and time again that we've been able to bring people together. I put this in just to show that one of the ways you can find out about your own family history or try and answer questions like the ones we've been trying to answer is there are the most incredible archives in the state libraries. This is a book of photographs from the state library that people compiled in the 1920s, largely forgotten, largely ignored. But now there's a huge sense of pride. The chap on the left here, Frank Aitchison, his son Sam, who's I think almost 90 or in his 90s, he's a Facebook user. And he was perusing the photographs and he saw his dad. And he contacted us and we were a little bit sceptical. But it turned out that you couldn't mistake it. It was an absolute dead ringer. And you'll see in the book Sam's photograph. He served in World War II. He's a dead ringer for his daddy. But I do want to pay tribute to Frank and his mates because there's a battle that you should all know about called Fromelles, which happened in July of 1916. It's largely been eradicated from Australia's memory because it was such a bitter, awful, bloody disaster for Australia. I think in the space of one 12-hour period, 5,350 something Australian boys were either killed or wounded on an area not much bigger than about 3 or 4 football fields. The whole thing was a travesty. It was a completely unnecessary battle. And Frank was one of the survivors. And when Sam contacted us, he was hoping that these two gentlemen in the photograph were two men who died standing right next to Frank at Fromelles. And sadly, when we looked at the service files of the men that he was talking about, it couldn't possibly be, because the tragedy was they got on a train in Marseille, gone straight up to the battlefield, got off, got to the slaughter. And Frank was the only survivor out of his troop of friends. But there is a lovely postscript. You might all know the story of the grave, the recently discovered grave at Fromelles. And we were able to tell Sam the story of how, through DNA testing, and as a result of the passion of a historian, an English teacher from a boys' school in Melbourne called Lambis and Gleasus, the Australian Defence Department was badgered into digging for a particular gravesite that he'd always persisted in believing was there. And lo and behold, there were 100 or so Australian diggers that had been put into a grave by the Germans. And Frank's two friends were among those that they found. And so they were given a decent burial just a couple of years ago. This war still lives on in people's memories. This is a lovely one. I never realised, forgive my ignorance on this, you'll laugh at me, how much the Protestants and the Catholics didn't get on at one stage in Australia. And this is a lovely story of a Catholic priest, James Gilbert, and a Protestant doctor, Keith Doig. And Keith wrote the most beautiful letters that you can read in the book, describing the friendship that he had with this, he thinks, Irish chaplain. He was actually a Kiwi. And he probably was of Irish background. But they huddled together in the cold in the trenches. And Keith wrote letters back to his beau, who he later married, and described this chaplain. We were able to give the family this beautiful picture they'd again never seen before that showed this friendship. I can't tell you every single story in this image, but I like it because, one, it shows how the backdrop was used to class up the photographs. But there's one bloke I'd love to pay tribute to, because in the battalion diary that records his death, the gentleman in the top left, Harold Griffith, was such a loved officer that when he died, not too long after this photograph was taken, his men insisted on carrying him out of the front lines and giving him a proper escort out of the battlefield. And it describes a period of history that, again, I'm gobsmacked. I'm 50 this year, and all of the men, the young men that fought this war, so many of them were in their teens. Some of them were, you'll see, boys. Most of these men here were 20, 21, 22, and they saw the most terrible, terrible things. Les Macon at the bottom right. If you had a leg blown off or a limb blown off in the war, you had a very little chance of survival. Les's relatives in Melbourne, one of them is named Perce, after the brother that Les used to write back to, talking about the horrors of the war. What happened to Les was what happened to so many men. His leg was blown off and they couldn't help him in time, and he died from infection in a field hospital. This bloke, Joseph Wood, happier story. This is Joseph in Vignacourt during the war, and this is Joseph on the left in the 1940s. And there's a lovely story. I was at the War Memorial doing something very similar to this a few weeks ago, and a bloke walked up to me, and he turned out to be one of I think, great nephews of Joseph Wood. And he confirmed a story that I'd heard from another member of the family, that Joseph was always a cheery bloke, and one of the things he loved doing was he could throw his crutch and get the kids just behind the back of the knee. And he laughed, tipped his head back and said, "Yeah, that's right, that's exactly what he used to do." This is a special photograph because it's probably, we think, the only known photograph of a very interesting, that records a very interesting thing in our history. The fact that 400 to 500 Aboriginals served in the First World War and were completely ignored and forgotten about. But officially, only people of the white race were allowed to serve in the First World War. It was quite racist. But as the terrible losses of Fromelles, Posier and Bullecourt mounted, they allowed people of colour to begin enlisting. This young gentleman was one of them. And again, we haven't found him yet, but the family of the man on the left contacted me the other week. And we think we now know the Aboriginal reserve from where this young gentleman came from, and we're trying to find his family. This is a lovely shot, purely and simply for the fact that the two blokes on either side are obviously brothers, and maybe they are all brothers. The tragedy was so many young men joined up in the same units, and I find myself looking at this photograph asking, did these blokes survive? Because brothers often died in the same moment, the same battle, because they were standing next to each other and they were caught in the same burst of machine gun fire. And until they started changing the rules about enlistment and spreading boys from the same family among different units, often you had whole families wiped out. And so there's a chapter in the book devoted to brothers. We basically look into their eyes, and I find myself asking myself all the time, did these blokes survive? This one, boy, this one really mattered to me. This chap we now believe is called George Gilbert. And when we first stared into his eyes, I'll just show you a close-up of his face. He's such a sad, sad, sad boy. And he was a boy. When he enlisted, he was probably about 15 or 16. He'd only just arrived in Australia. And he was called up for King and Country, and he duly served. And he almost made it. What we were trying to do was find out who he was, because his image bobs up in many photographs. And we found this one in a French museum, but you can see him in the top right there, same sad, mournful face. And Kerry, my wife, and I often found ourselves staring into his face. You get attached to a particular photograph. I really wanted to know what happened to this poor bloke. And then we had a breakthrough. Laurent Marouz, at our request, searched the archives of a French museum and found this one. It didn't have complete captions, but it had a name, Parton, for this bloke here, Horace Parton. And by serendipitous happy circumstance, I found Trevor Parton, who is his son. And Trevor, as it turned out, had a whole series of letters that Horace had written back from the First World War, including a quite amusing description of each and every man in this photograph. Except a few, including the bloke up the back right. But by a process of exclusion, we were able to figure out it was George Gordon Gilbert, and he died in the defence of Amiens in the final few months of the war. Some of the photos are just fun. They recorded village life. This is Arthur van der Stok, a boxer before the war, photographed by Louis Tullier in the barnyard that still exists of the Tullier farmhouse. There was a lot of this kind of recreational activity. They had sports, they had theatre troupes, they had weddings. Harry Hartley married a lovely girl called Simone Picourt, who was a local Vignecourt girl. Tragedy though, because in the Second World War, Harry of course was still a reserve British officer. He'd set up a tyre company for motor cars and motorbikes in Amiens, and when the Nazis invaded, he had to flee. We don't know what happened, but what we do know is that he died, and it was possibly on the rush to Dunkirk to try and get the hell out of France before he was arrested by the Nazis. A lot of the photos, and I love them for this, they show diggers letting their hair down. These are not formal photographs. The bloke on the right there is completely cut. He's had a few wines. And I love the fact that they portray these blokes, and I'd love to tell you the story of each and every one of them. Angus Wilson, who's seated on the left there in the middle, he was a military medal winner from memory, and correct me if I'm wrong, Kerry, but I think he came back to Sydney and ended up working on the docks in Darling Harbour, but basically, like so many of these blokes, disappeared into obscurity, didn't speak about the war, and until we contacted a lot of their families, a lot of them didn't know the history. Again, another photograph we really care about, a photograph that records the pain of what these blokes went through. Have a look at the bloke on the left, and then look at his eyes. See those eyes? We were trying to figure out who he is. The great thing about the fact that there are 3 or 4 photographs of him and they're of such great quality is you can see that medal ribbon there. That medal ribbon is a military medal. And we gave it a cursory look, Peter Burness at the War Memorial and I, and we went, well, how are we going to find a bloke from that battalion with a military medal? Because there's quite a lot of them. And then we had a closer look. And if you look, you can see a little metal dot in the middle of the military medal. And we've discovered that there are only 8 blokes from that battalion who won the military medal. And so now, with the help of the wonderful people from our National Archives and some genealogists who are as nutty about this subject as me and clearly you, we're trying to find their families. And I'm hoping I can reunite their families with that image. Fred Johnson is the bloke in the extraordinary sheepskin on the right. I like this story because if any of you were growing up in Sydney in the 1950s and the 60s, he's the bloke who opened the door at the GPO post office in Marketplace and said, "Good morning." And he never spoke about the war. This particular photograph, and I know I've got to wind up soon so you can ask questions, one of the most special moments, of course, was the 11th of the 11th, 1918. And there are very few photographs of Armistice Day around the front lines, because the British didn't allow cameras. The Aussies took box brownies to Gallipoli, but they weren't allowed to take cameras to the Western Front. And sadly, the war photographers were generally British and British-centric. Frank Hurley, who you've all heard of, I'm sure, went there briefly in 1917. He had a huge blue with Charles Bean and disappeared to Egypt soon after. So there weren't a lot of Australian war photographers. Louis Tullier took this extraordinary photograph of what we now know to be the very moment of the declaration of Armistice. And they're all looking up at something. Have a look at what they're looking up at. And I'll just let you pause for a moment. Joe Maxwell describes this moment in his book, Hell's Bells and Mademoiselles. He describes this amazing party they had, where everybody opened the wine cellars and started dancing in the streets. We had a great time on Sunday night reenacting that with the townsfolk of Vignecourt, who dressed up in period costume and reenacted dancing for us. And the great thing is a lot of the locations where the photographs were taken still exist, including this location. And one of the moments that Joe describes is a moment where the tricolour, the French national flag, and the Australian flag carried up the steeple precariously by 2 diggers, a guy called Binskin. And then they pushed their arms out, hanging on for dear life from the steeple, and waved these flags. And if you look very, very carefully, you can just see the tricolour, just there. That very moment that Joe Maxwell describes. I have to say, Joe didn't stick around for long. He hopped on the back of a truck and went down to the Folie Bergère in Paris. By all accounts, had a great night. There's another moment, and I'll finish soon on this. 3 days after the Armistice, the people of Vignacourt had all these Allied soldiers. Most of them were Australians. And hundreds, thousands of Australians had got to know the locals of Vignacourt. They'd developed a bond, and it exists to this day. The woman who gave us the breakthrough, Robert Cronier's widow, Henriette Cronier, beautiful woman, she had a plaque on her wall, a map of Australia, and I pointed to it, my faltering schoolboy French. I could understand what she said. And she wept, and she said, "N'oubliez pas jamais les Australiens." Never forget the Australians. And they never, ever have. And this woman's friends, there were 2 people in the village whom she introduced us to. One of them described her as a very, very young woman. She'd gone to the graves of Australian soldiers and tended the graves. And this is that moment. Every child in Vignacourt was given a grave to look after until the Commonwealth War Graves Commission came in and replaced them with the limestone graves. And I assure you, they looked after them beautifully. And this is the moment where the French military and the local dignitaries, one of them the local, I suppose the local governor is the rough equivalent, he stood up and he said of the Australians, they were the bravest of the brave. And they were. And many of them still rest in this cemetery that's in Vignacourt. And I commend the town to you because you can now go, as a result of this story, to a beautiful museum that they've created. It will soon be moved into the Tullier house, which has been bought for the purpose. And it has beautiful photographs, all of these blown up on the wall. And there are lovely local school children who've all memorised the story of an Australian soldier and who will tell you their story. And they remember, they have never forgotten the Australians. Thank you. I'm told I'm allowed to take a few questions, so if anybody has a question, I'm happy to take it. Yes, ma'am. I'm asked how far is Vignacourt from Villa-Bretonneux? It's about 45 minutes drive.
Okay, so someone who died in Bosnia, like my great uncle, could possibly be in one of those photographs?
One of the field hospitals that they would have been brought to at the time was the Vignacourt Field Hospital. And in fact, Kerry and I are actually going to Vignacourt and Villa-Bretonneux to pay our respects to one of her relatives who died at Villa-Bretonneux. Anybody else? Oh, hello. Yes?
Not really a question, but about 2 years ago we also had one of those moments and discovered 100 letters from my great uncle, and it went from before the war, just before the war, and to the landing of Gallipoli where he was, and right through the entire war, 4 years worth of letters back home.
Have you preserved them?
Yes, and I've published them on the internet as well.
Oh, I'd love to see it.
So
I'll
you
give
can
you a
also
card.
do a search, and we actually get emails almost every day. Someone's done a search on a name, and my great uncle, has actually mentioned other soldiers.
Well, that's one of the things that really helped us in our research. Is quite often, as I was telling you with Trevor Parton, whose daddy Horace Parton was one of the people in the images, it was because of the letters that Horace wrote that gave us the breakthrough to identify that poor, sad-faced digger, George Gilbert. And actually, there's a wonderful thing that happened in the 20s. They started collecting the diaries of soldiers, and the State Library has a collection of the diaries of many soldiers from the First World War that have been preserved. And you can also, if you're interested at all in searching your family history, the wonderful thing for us, and I can't speak too highly of it, is the ability to access these digitised resources in the National Archives, personal service files, and also battalion diaries. Personal service files are in the National Archives, and the battalion diaries are on the War Memorial website. And you can actually read these online. And we would actually be sitting, I can remember I was sitting on the battlefield in Cozières, and we were really keen to identify one digger. And I'm tapping into the internet with a dongle internet connection on the battlefield of Coulthart, looking at the service file in the battlefield and picking up bits of shrapnel off the battlefield at the same time. Very, very moving. And you're thinking, wow, the bloke I'm reading about died right here. And you get a sense of the ridiculousness, the horror of what they were facing. Yes?
My grandfather was forced to stay back and help bury the dead because he had been supplying unbroken horses to the army. And that was his punishment.
We may have a photo of it.
That's just what I was going to ask you. Were any photos taken after the war of the situation?
Yes, there were, and in fact, one of the chapters that, funnily enough, I find the most moving is, you might have seen those graves, the temporary graves that I showed you images of earlier. There's a horrendously sad chapter where a mother was pleading with the Defence Department to get a beautiful carved cross. And the reason I say we might have a photo of your relative is because there's photographs of blokes from the grave burial team standing beside some of these crosses. And this poor mother pleaded for years, right into the 1920s, to try and get a copy of to get the cross delivered to Australia. And the brutal and unemotional way that they dealt with this poor woman, it's so sad. And these days we take for granted to be able to hop on a plane and fly to France, but for most families, even people of means, it was an impossible thing to hop on a boat and go to the other side of the world to look at your son's gravesite. And there was a policy of not repatriating these men's remains. And so for a lot of these families, the only way for them to have anything was a photograph. And so post-war, Louis photographed a lot of graves. And there are a lot of the photographs of crosses in the book. Well, that's probably a good point to stop because I'm told we're only allowed 3 questions. Thank you very much.